All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. So we have gotten our first update of the year. It was a hotfix, but it came with, I think, a rather important and very good change, which gives me the opportunity to make this video. So what was the change that came in this patch? The change that came in this patch is that we now have full customizability over the tap hold abilities. So previously, this invert tap hold abilities was just a toggle, and they'd either be inverted or not inverted. But now we have a suite of wonderful options for how we want our abilities to act by default. So we can either have just standard or inverted defaults, which is great. So you can either have it work the normal way or inverted as a standard for all your frames if you want it to be simple. And inside of each frame, you have three options, which is either default, inverted, or standard. So you can have it be either whatever your default is, or set to standard if your default is inverted or whatnot. You just have the full suite of options for what you want on these different Warframes, which is so nice. And for this video, I am going to be going through all 13 of the Warframes that have the invertible tap hold abilities, talking about why they should be inverted or not inverted, and how that is going to affect the gameplay of each of them. So we are going to go in alphabetical order as it is organized here, starting with, of course, Chroma. So Chroma, it might be surprising to some people that you would go with standard. And the reason you go with standard on Chroma is because with the new functionality for his one, you can swap between the elements, and then you do this on a tap. You go between these, and then your 2 is whatever element you happen to be on. And also your 4 and your 1 are whatever element you happen to be on. But the reason that Chroma goes with standard is because in pretty much no case would you ever want to hold your 1 and do the breath ability. So because you pretty much never want to do that, you basically just remove the hold from the equation entirely and just make it so you can switch between your elements very quickly. This is helpful because you pretty much never want to use electricity or toxin. So if you're on cold and you need fire, because that will heal Chroma, you can very quickly switch over to fire and cast whatever relevant ability you want to then be using. So for Chroma, definitely sticking to standard, I think, is going to be the best for him. So up next, we have Gauss to talk about. Gauss is a really interesting case because there's a number of reasons that relate to a quality of life change as to why you would want this to be inverted. So if we go in and look at the options here, I have Gauss on inverted as it stands. And the really important thing about this is that Gauss's ability that gets inverted is his 3. So Gauss's 3 is also his infused ability. And the really nice thing, the really big think ahead that DE has actually done with this is that if you have Gauss on standard or inverted, that also, across all of the Warframes that have his 3 infused, makes it standard or inverted. And that's really important because Gauss's 3 is actually a really good leveling tool for other Warframes to be infused with while they're going through their level up process of going through Sanctuary Onslaught and stuff. So that's really nice. And also, I think this should be inverted anyway on Gauss because his 3 on its inverted state is just more useful. Those who don't know the 2 modes on Gauss, you have the usual tap, which is this field of cold that is going to slow enemies or freeze them whenever you're at full red line. And then you also have the blast version, or the fire version, which is going to do a heat proc and like the usual heat stun and stuff, and also more damage than the cold version. So because heat strips armor is also a stun, and it does more damage, I would generally want it to be on heat always, but especially so for the leveling build, you always want this to be on heat. So just for kind of across the game usability, I think you pretty much always want this to be inverted, as it's just going to be more convenient in pretty much all ways. And in the case where you need to freeze enemies with Gauss, you always have the ability to hold it and do it real quick. And because that's not the norm for what Gauss is doing, I think this is going to be better. So moving on next, we have Grendel. So Grendel's case is actually really simple in that there's not really much of a choice here. So this changes how his 2 rotates. So you have Nourished Armor, Nourished Strike, and Nourished Energy. Basically, the way that this works is that Nourished Strike is the buff worth using. Maybe on a hard, way possible maybe occasion, you would choose to go with Nourished Energy or Nourished Armor. But 99.9% of the time, Nourished Strike is the buff that you actually want to be using. So you just want this to switch to it and then just be able to tap it to activate this ability at will, as opposing to have to stop and hold it to get that ability to go off. So for Grendel, this is pretty simple. Up next, we have Ivara, and then Khora and Lavos. So very quickly for Ivara, Ivara actually has a kind of argument for both ways to do this. And what I mean by that is that because there are multiple ways to use Ivara, it's really going to depend on your situation. For me personally, I like to tap it to fire the arrow. But the argument for that is basically that sleep arrow is going to be usually the one that you're going to always use. Like, if you're in the position where sleep arrow is pretty much the one you fire out and you kind of don't shoot any of the other ones, almost certainly having this just be inverted is going to be better for you. However, if you want to be able to switch fast, because for those of you that don't know, if you have your 4 out, your alt fire becomes the arrow that you're on. You won't have a pause between switching to all your different arrows. That action can be like really clunky if you're like trying to do a bunch of cloaking and also sleeping and like also firing dash wires and doing all this stuff off of your alt fire. You can technically do that stuff faster if you do not have your 1 inverted. But as it stands, I think both ways there's an argument for doing it both ways, but I prefer inverted on Ivara in particular. Up next we have Khora. So Khora's kind of really doesn't matter at all, but I do have a preference for it. And the preference is basically that, like... Oh, hold on. Sorry, I have to switch builds on Khora because I replaced this ability. But it is Khora's 3 that gets changed here on almost all cases. So basically, if you tap the ability, you activate the skill for Venari to mark an enemy or an ally to either hurt or heal them, and you hold it to switch forms. In general, I like to be on the healing one, as you can tap this to have Venari heal yourself, or whatever ally or whatever you happen to be looking at can heal objectives and stuff like that as well. And that is generally my preferred way to go about it, and you kind of don't want to accidentally like tap 3 and have it do this animation to switch you between all the different forms, in my opinion. So that's what I would generally go with here. Up next, we have Lavos. So I've gone over why you want Lavos inverted before, but let's go over Lavos right now. Lavos, the reason that you want Lavos inverted is because Lavos' abilities are already on a cooldown, so you're not going to have a need to like very quickly spam them. But what you are probably going to have a need to do is to very quickly add things into his vial system. So if I wanted to go viral in the non-inverted way, I'd have to hold 1 and then hold 2 to get it to be viral. But when they're inverted, quick tap-a-tapas. And boom, there we go. And then when you hold for the abilities, they're going to be on cooldown anyway, so you're not really heavily spamming any of Lavos' stuff because you literally can't. So it's going to be much more efficient for me to be like, oh, I need corrosive, there it is. And then now here we go, throwing out the 4. Doing stuff like that is pretty much always going to be more efficient just for Lavos' general playstyle. Moving on, let's talk about Mag. So Mag is really, really super simple stuff here. We have her 2, which has the relatively recent functionality of being able to be held so that you can go into this mode. You never want to do this. This is like basically completely and totally useless. So because you never want to do that mode, you just want your tap to be your regular functionality for this, where you put the bubble on the enemies, because that is kind of the thing Mag is supposed to do with her kit. That is pretty important for just general usability. You don't want to use the bad part of the ability all the time, so just keeping it on standard is definitely the way to go. Now, moving on, we have Protea, which is an interesting case because Protea, both sides of her invertible ability are both really, really compelling and like useful, and they're kind of for different reasons. But my preferred is to keep it inverted because whenever you tap the ability, you'll throw out her little shield balls. Now, the reason for that is that this is the ability I tend to spam. If I'm in a dangerous situation with Protea where I need to survive, generally I will just continually just throw out a ton of these and like fill an area so that if I lose one, I immediately get my shields right back and everything is just like, I'm totally fine. My shield gates are up and like I don't have a chance of dying. This is generally how Protea is going to be able to survive like higher level encounters and stuff like that. So that's really, really useful. That is not to say that the other form, the AoE form, is not useful, because this ability can legitimately be used as a map clearing ability in lower level missions. In lower level missions, this can actually be quite deadly, as you can just, like, you know, throw it around and basically cover the whole map. Like, have no problem with this just killing everything that's in all the AoEs. This can be used in low level survivals. Like, there's actually a good number of applications for doing this. So if you're going to be going into a low level farm, there's maybe some consideration for you to actually re-invert this, because at lower levels, you're not going to have even close to as much of a need for the shield gadget as opposed to the just killing all these enemies in this room gadget. But at higher levels, definitely I would trend towards the shields instead. And for me personally, I'd rather have the survivability be a little more accessible than the damage I don't use very often be more accessible. Moving on, we have Titania. So Titania is a pretty interesting one, because I think Titania is almost able to invert her abilities and would usually want to be doing that. And the reason that I say usually is because Titania kind of has a little bit of clunk in her kit. And what I mean by that is that, so her 1 and 2 get inverted. So usually whenever you cast your 1, you need to target, but if you hold your 1, you'll cast on yourself to give yourself status immunity and stuff. That's usually the form that you're going to be using, especially to use the augment on her 4 and get all those buffs out, which I feel is going to be the normal way that Titania is going to get played for a lot of people. But the other thing that would invert is your 2, and usually you want to be using Thorns and Dust. And what that ends up being is, if you want to have Thorns and Dust active, you have to hold to cast them. But if you were doing hold to switch, you would need to hold to go to Full Moon and then hold to go through Entangle to get back to Thorns. So even though I do want to cast Thorns and I do want to cast Dust, it's a much more of a time saver, in my opinion, to be able to get to the buff that you want to get by just, like, skipping past the like, really useless buffs. Because Full Moon and Entangle are way not useful. If I literally had an option to remove Full Moon and remove Entangle, I would invert my controls on Titania. But because I can't easily skip past those or, like, not interact with them at all, I think that it's better to keep it on standard, unless you're just planning not to use her 2 at all. In which case, I would probably invert it to make her 1 just slightly better. So, moving on past Titania, we have Vauban. So, Vauban, this is a really, really easy invert. And also, there's stuff of note here with why you invert it. So, interestingly, whenever you throw Vauban's 4, if it's inverted, it still works exactly the same way. And the reason for that is you have to hold to collapse the Bastille. Because of that, you do always need to hold to throw out just a regular Vortex. Because that part is not the part that gets inverted, I think it's actually much, much better to invert what we have on here, because you pretty much only ever want to be using the Flechette Grenades. This is, like, the most useful thing, bar none, on his 2, and you just want to be able to throw a bunch of them out. And, like, if you're in a Vauban build that is using these, this is the thing that you're going to be doing. You're probably going to be throwing a bunch of them. That's where you're going to be at with Vauban. So it's going to be much, much better to be able to rapid fire those out as opposed to having to hold for each and every one. And it's just going to be more efficient to do it that way in general. Now, moving on, we have Wisp, I believe. Yes, we have Wisp. So, Wisp, this is also going to be kind of like maybe a weird option for me personally, but I like to be able to switch between these easily. And this is for very similar reasons as to the reason for Titania, and that's because in general I would say the shock reservoir is not one that you need to care very much about, and due to that you're going to be just like holding to cast down the reservoirs, and I think that this flow is a little better. I wouldn't tell anyone they were wrong if you wanted to invert this, if you were especially one of the people that's just going to sit on like the health moat all the time. If you're just always going to be there, then tapping to throw that down is like absolutely valid. But if you're someone that's going to be using haste and vitality, like I think in general you should always have those 2 up, I think putting it on to the standard is just going to be better for you overall. Moving on, let's talk about Xaku, who is also kind of a very, very simple one to talk about. Obviously, I just very recently did a video on this for Xaku's new build, so if you'd like to see that, go check that video out. But you definitely want this inverted. And the reason you want it inverted is because Deny and Accuse are kind of doing absolutely nothing in this kit, and you're pretty much always going to cast Gaze. So because you're always going to cast Gaze, you just switch to it and then just tap the ability to cast it, is just going to make your experience playing Xaku less clunky, in my opinion, and you're just going to have a better time overall. And they, of course, are a little clunky in general. Like, they need the Hellman system to really buff themselves up and be more able to do the higher level stuff in a better capacity, in my opinion. So this just helps alongside that to make it a more enjoyable experience. And then we have the weird one at the end here, that it's kind of a change that preempted the change. And that is that whenever they added functionality to Zephyr, what they did is they gave Zephyr's 2 a push ability to go alongside, or they gave Zephyr a pull ability to go alongside the push. And the push used to be the tap, but DE themselves actually went in and inverted this prior to this change, where we can customize them all individually. So leaving Zephyr on standard is going to be better, because the pulling enemies together is always going to be better than pushing enemies away from each other, because this groups them up to be, you know, eliminated much more effectively. That's kind of the whole point. Obviously, it's kind of, you know, funny that DE realized this, and that's pretty clearly why they made the change, I think. But it just means that you just leave Zephyr on standard, and it's a bit confusing given the rash of Zephyr changes that we've had in the recent history here. So yeah, that's the stuff here. Really interesting is that this was like very clearly a needed change, and the reason I say that is because if you look at these 13 options, it's actually a 6-7 split on inverted and not inverted in terms of what I at least think personally is kind of optimal for each of these different Warframes, which is like, I mean, that's about as compelling as it gets, I think. Like, that really says the whole story on why it was nice for them to add this option, because switching between these different Warframes and having it be the option that you wanted and going into the menu all the time to be like, oh, no, I'm playing Xaku and I was playing Wisp, like, going back and forth between those types of things could get really annoying, and this just kind of permanently solves it. All the Warframes will just go in here, change them to work the way that you want them to work, and boom, that Warframe now permanently does the thing that you're looking for it to do, and I think that is a really great change. Like, great hotfix to start out the year, really good stuff here, just great options, and I'm looking forward to hopefully more changes like this. There's been talk at the end of the year that like maybe Warframe will get like an auction house situation, and Warframe Market probably won't be needed anymore, and that sounds like it might be really cool. Hopefully that's the trend of 2021 for Warframe, is just really high quality changes, and probably also some high quality updates, but we'll see. Obviously last year I think in general was good and bad, but it had to follow up the very poor ending to 2019, so we'll see how things go. I'm looking forward to more changes and stuff, but at least this is pretty much as good as it could possibly get. All the options are there. There's no real requests that I would have for it. So yeah, that is going to do it for today's video. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed it, and I will see you tomorrow. Goodbye, everybody.